So we're going to slowly begin. Sheila Fitzpatrick by this time needs no introduction to you fellows, and I want to just mention that you can't keep this woman down. I said to her that I'll have to spend the next year reading all the new books that she's been publishing, and she's been working on this topic of migration and displaced persons. So she's going to speak for about 50 minutes on lost souls, Soviet displaced persons, and the birth of the Cold War, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Sheila.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so this is an area that we haven't so far talked very much about. That is refugees and how one copes with a refugee problem. As it happened, I just wrote this book called Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced Persons after the Second World War. I think I forget, even after what I said about titles to you, I forget my own subtitle. So I'm drawing on that book, which is coming out in a few months with Princeton, but also with on a book that I wrote a few years ago called White Russians, Red Peril. And that was about Soviet displaced persons coming to Australia and in the beginning Cold War and contributing to that. So I draw on that, also on that regional example in what I say. So what I'm going to do is examine the crisis caused by displacement of peoples after the Second World War, specifically the displacement of people from Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union, people who, in the wake of the war, found themselves under the care of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria and Italy. And the basic context of this is that these are people who arrived in Germany involuntarily, many of them as forced laborers brought to the Reich as Ostarbeiter, men and women, therefore, in that group, more men than women, but still a substantial contingent of women, plus prisoners of war who were ended the war in German prisoner of war camps. These are mainly from the Soviet army. And also a large but not very well identified contingent of people who had followed the Germans out of the Soviet Union as they withdrew from their wartime occupation. Now, that is particularly characteristically the case of the Baltic displaced persons. They very often left in the wake, well, essentially, not exactly with the Germans, but at the same time, in the autumn of 1944. So this is a mixed group of people, as I said. Well, there are millions of them straight after the war. But the majority of them are fairly quickly repatriated to their countries of origin. But the group I'm talking about, the contingent, it's about 1 million people who are not repatriated and therefore assume the formal status of displaced persons. Now, I should also say that among the displaced persons, I'll call them DPs, as that was what they were called at the time. Among them, there are many from the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries, and there are many Jews. But Jews are not the majority among them. Often, if you speak, especially to Germans, you say you're working on displaced persons, and they assume that these are the Jewish displaced persons. They are a group. I think it's perhaps about 1/3 of the total, but they're not the majority, and it is basically a different story for Jewish DPs from the story for Slavic DPs. I will indicate that from time to time, but my main focus is on the Slavic DPs. UNRWA has all these people, UNRWA and, of course, the occupying. UNRWA is working together with the occupation military governments set up by the British, the Americans, and the French, and the French in Germany. The Soviets also have occupying a zone of Germany, but they really don't deal directly with displaced persons. It's not a category they use. If there are people not from Germany in their zone, they basically send them back to the Soviet Union or Poland or wherever it is. Or if they appear particularly troublesome and unwilling to do that, they ship them over into the Western zones. So we're talking here about UNRWA working together with the American, British, and French military governments, and of course the Allied military command. Now, the first UNRWA at first assumes that the solution to having displaced persons after a war is to help them repatriate. They assume that repatriation is what will happen, and of course that appears to be what is stated in the Yalta agreements as well. But that almost immediately becomes clear that that is a problem because of the resistance, the unwillingness of many of the DPs to repatriate, notably those from the Soviet Union. Now, that's an interesting question in terms of what's going on with this large-scale refusal to repatriate. The Allies at first cooperate with the Soviets in returning their people, in repatriating their people, in part because they want their own people repatriated without any trouble. Then, because of acts of resistance and manifestations of unwillingness to go back, which get into the press, get discussed in Britain, in Parliament, in the USA, in Congress, they pull back and they no longer actively facilitate repatriation and accept that at least in the short term, there's a problem that they're going to have to deal with via setting up this network of DP camps. But it's one of UNRWA's problems that if repatriation is not the task, not their base, if the repatriation is not the mission, what is the end product of their care of DPs going to be? That's a question mark that hangs over that institution. Now, I want here to introduce the definition of a displaced person that UNRWA uses. UNRWA considers a displaced person to be a victim of the war and fascism. In other words, it's somebody who is, of course, displaced from country of origin, involuntarily displaced. So a victim of war and fascism is the definition they come in with, which, of course, is an obvious one based on the situation before them. That's the reason. One of the reasons I stress that is that at a later point, it's the definition of who the DPs are is going to change. Why the resistance to repatriation? Well, it is. There are various threads in this. Clearly, one is the fear of punishment for collaboration. Because there are among the DPs, there are all kinds of stories, of course, that individual DPs have, but there is a substantial group that has, in fact, fought in units, Russian, Latvian Legion, or whatever, under German command against the Soviet Union in the latter phases of the war, and there are people who may have collaborated in other ways too. They are, of course, frightened of punishment for that. The people who have willingly left, voluntarily left with the Germans, also would anticipate punishment. And I think the whole group has an uneasy feeling about how a sojourn in a foreign country, however involuntary, would be viewed on return to the Soviet Union. But that is actually not the only factor in the resistance. I shouldn't use resistance because that sounds like an armed, violent act. I mean the unwillingness, the expressed unwillingness to return. But there's another factor which was never made manifest in the discussions about this issue at all, but that a number of the displaced persons and I think the majority of those who strongly object to repatriation are people who do not regard the Soviet Union as their homeland. In other words, they come from Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and the Baltics, territories that were annexed to the Soviet Union by the terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939. From their point of view, the Soviet Union is not the homeland, but an occupying power. And so their unwillingness to return is fully understandable. As far as we can tell, people from the old Soviet Union were much less frequently disinclined to return. So the problem was to a large extent that of DPs from the areas that had been recently annexed. One of the problems, however, well, there are several problems associated with this. One is that the forms of registration do not give us the information about who came, do not give us reliable information about who actually came, with the exception of the Baltics, where we can identify the people. But as far as Ukrainians are registered, there is not a reliable distinction made between people who come from West Ukraine and people who come from Soviet Ukraine. The presumption is, however, that the former predominate in part because, of course, those regions are closer to Germany and therefore more people, they were occupied first, more people are taken as Ostarbeiter from those regions. The second thing complicating the situation is that the Soviet Union says it wants everybody back, and it makes no distinction. It behaves as if all those DPs have the Soviet Union as the homeland, and there is no problem or complication about that. In a way, this was incredibly bad, a bad public relations position, because the conclusion the Allies drew was that no Soviets want to go back. There was not a very clear understanding on the Allied part of the distinction between old and new Soviet citizens, and the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union never mentioned it, it remains in the shadows. But I think it's very important, not only for the in terms of the refusal to return, but also in terms of the kind of DP culture that develops in the camps, which I will be discussing later. The Soviets keep insisting on return of their people, citing Yalta, and not without reason, because that was what appears to have been agreed. And they describe the refusal, the increasing refusal or evasiveness of the Allies on this issue as essentially a theft of their people, a theft of their people. The sense of ownership is quite interestingly conveyed. It is almost as if you were talking about serfs. You know, these are my serfs. So the theft of Soviet people, and that argument is going to develop later. I'll come back to the reason given for the theft, apart from capitalist malevolence, in a later part of the talk. the opinion that becomes established among the Allies and the displaced persons, the Soviet origin displaced persons, is that everyone who returns is likely to be sent to Gulag. Now, the reality was not quite that. In fact, everybody that returned went through filtration process to see if they'd been collaborators or whatever, and a proportion were sent to Gulag, but it was actually a small proportion, 7%, which is really quite a small proportion. However, only something, a bit under half, in fact, go home, of those who repatriate are sent home. That includes a lot of women. Almost all the women simply go home. I mean, the filtration, they're not worried about women because, well, in part because they weren't likely to have fought against them. But then the rest of, quite a large group of the men who return, they're not sent to Gulag, they're not sent home, they're sent back into the army or into labor battalions. So they're drafted for a period of years. Well, you know, being drafted for a period of years to work somewhere in the Soviet Union, fairly standard procedure, and a bit different from Gulag, but it is, but still, the belief among the Allies and in the DP camps is that repatriation means Gulag. Now, just a few words about UNRWA before I turn to the question of the DPs themselves. UNRWA is an organization that was set up during the war by the Allies to cope with the post-war situation, whatever it might be. Not specifically displaced persons, though that's a part of the mandate, but the whole rebuilding effort. The Soviet Union was one of the participants, one of the basic members of this organization, set up in 1943. The personnel of what became a large institution, the personnel are of mixed nationalities. There are lots of Americans, and among the Americans, a lot of them with a sort of New Deal, coming out of New Deal agencies, and with that sort of approach, you've got British. The British are a bit different from the Americans. The British come out of the military. Their social justice interests are less, let's say. The French, who play a much less distinctive role and have a smaller occupation zone and are often not even consulted. It's really hard to characterize them. You have a military presence among the French in UNRWA, but you also have some communists. You've got a mixed bag there. But I would say that it's the British and the Americans who predominate. There are also Soviets in UNRWA. Soviet centers officials. The funding for UNRWA comes from the member countries. However, in practice, and it's distributed according, I don't know, I forget exactly what criterion, but basically on wealth and size. But in practice, the US pays the greater amount. The Soviet Union was meant to pay a fairly substantial slice, but it never did, without actually saying it wouldn't, it didn't. The British, with some difficulty, are the second largest supporters of UNRWA. Given the funding, it is an institution that depends on the continuing support of the US, including of the US Congress, which signs off on the budget. And this is a constant problem. It exists from 1943 to 47, UNRWA, and the last year of the war and the first post-war years are full of basically of Congress saying, well, this is the last lot of money we give, and UNRWA saying, oh, but please, and you know, the British government saying, but this is still a problem, and so, okay, we vote a little bit more money, but the writing is on the wall about definitely a sense on the part of US Congress, this is a finite process and it needs to be closed down. Now, I want to shift now from the sort of the high politics, geopolitical aspect to the more social history view of the situation, that is looking at the DPs themselves. We've got lots of memoirs of people who were DPs and who ended up somewhere else and wrote their memoirs, and the story they tell is almost invariably pawns of fate. We were swept up in events beyond our control, swept away from our homes, dumped somewhere, and then dumped somewhere else. And all of this we could do. We were helpless, carried along by the flood. Now, in a way that, in a sort of overall way, you could say that has some accuracy, but I'm also very struck by the extent of DP agency that is exercised in all kinds of situations, and I mean both collective agency of DPs and individual agency by individual DPs or families acting together. And it starts, the picture of agency that I draw, it starts even with what is a very familiar image of people with battered suitcases, individuals struggling across a war-shattered landscape, heading who knows where. That was a picture very widely circulated, and it would be true of many, but it's by no means true of all. And here I partly draw on my particular set of data, a particular data set I have about my husband and Michael Danos and his mother Olga, who were refugees from the Baltic, who were DPs from the Baltic, left in '44, and their friends. And they certainly were on the road with battered suitcases, but they had some addresses in their pockets. And in other words, they were heading, they had some addresses and they had some plans. They knew somebody here, they knew somebody there. Now, mind you, these are multilingual people with contacts, but it was not unique, especially in the Baltics, to actually have a sense of your own direction. You might not get to the place that you meant to get, but often you were able to. One of Misha's friends, this is a fully Latvian family, unlike Misha's, he had been, this friend, Andrzej Bichevskis, he'd been inducted into the Latvian Legion. He was fighting, or he was in a unit with Germans. He said, not fighting. Everyone says that. He says he was under the protection of his basketball coach. But in any case, so come the end of the war, Andrzej dumps his uniform and crosses the border, sort of merging into a DP stream, and he has an address in his pocket, which is a small town or village, it might have even been, in the north of Germany, that he and his family are going to try and meet up with. His grandmother, moving completely separately, and his brother and sister, his sister and brother-in-law, they are all separately heading in the same direction, and they all do meet up there. They don't stay there, but from just a few months after they're crossing the border, they are again a family unit in contact with each other, making plans to cope with, making ever-changing plans to cope with the ever-changing situation. And Misha was the same. Misha and his mother, they were going to meet on the in Flensburg, on the Danish border, with the hope of getting across the border so that Misha could go and study physics with Bohr. Anyway, that was their plan. They did meet in Flensburg. They didn't get across the border because it closed. But that's another example of people are not just milling around. They think they are going somewhere with their own plans. Then the next thing is the question of where agency is exercised. That is in telling who you are. Now, in most circumstances, when somebody asks you where you are, you have to produce who you are. You produce an identity document, a passport, a driver's license, whatever. In this case, some people had such if anyone had such identity documents, they often would ditch them because they gave the wrong identity. I mean, you may not want to have, if you find yourself in Europe at the end of a war, you may not want to have a Soviet identity anymore, and therefore you lose the documents, and there is no way of, UNRWA did not attempt to replace documents or check. They couldn't. You're dealing with millions of people. So basically you say to the DP before you, what's your name, where were you born, how old are you, marital status, and citizenship. And they tell you something and you write it down. Now that's sometimes a complication. That will sometimes happen through an interpreter. And if you are, for example, a Russian and you're saying you're a Pole, a very common situation, and the interpreter is Polish, he will of course know that you're not speaking, you don't sound like a Pole, and perhaps what you said was even in Russian, but how would the British officer know who's there? And in general, there was a solidarity of DPs, so the interpreters are not going to give these people away, and they can usually understand they're Russian or Russian Polish or whatever it is. And so you are whoever you say you are, and there's quite a lot of agency implicit in that act. Usually, the most usual, I think it was, as far as I can tell, it was the norm rather than the exception to have misstatements of your identity. Now, sometimes they would be of a fairly, you might say, venial kind, in other words, misstatements of age. Because everybody who's heading for a career as a DP will have some sense that it's better to be young than old. In other words, there may be cut-off ages for this and that. And so people, they take several years off their age. In the case of Misha's mother, she did it sequentially, and she ended up 10 years younger and somewhat younger than her elder sister, who also reduced her age, but not so extremely. Marital status, another very good thing to change. Hardly anybody is married. In other words, most people, perhaps however attached they are to a wife or whatever wife and children they left behind in the Soviet Union, that's gone. That life is over. It is a complication to be married to somebody not present, and so people don't declare marriages. And then there is the extremely very common misstatement on the part of Soviet citizens in particular of what UNRWA calls their nationality, which Soviets would have called their citizenship. So people, the preferred national identifications are Polish is good, Yugoslav is good, but you get some Czechs, you get some Latvians. I mean, you get some people calling themselves Latvian. Now, that's brought me into the complication of which I should have mentioned earlier, the complication about the Baltics. With regard, we're back now in the realm of diplomacy. The Soviets say that the Baltics are part of the Soviet Union, therefore everybody from Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia is a Soviet citizen who ought to be repatriated. The Allies never really buy that from the beginning, in particular the British. They do regard the incorporation of the Baltics as illegitimate. And so a different kind of calculation is applied. That meant that people from the Baltics felt right from the beginning, I think, more assurance they wouldn't be returned, so you have less misstatement of, I mean, Latvians tend to call themselves Latvians, basically, whereas Russians will very often call themselves, well, all the things that I've told you, but they will also call themselves stateless, and stateless means Russian emigre. The Russian emigres are a complicating factor around. They're not exactly victims of war and fascism. So initially, they're not eligible for the DP status, unless, of course, they had been, let's say, in Yugoslavia and forced to flee during the war. That you could make that kind of argument. But basically, they're not initially recognized as DPs, but after a while they are. And that, to many Soviets, looks like perhaps a better bet, a safer bet, because there was no, the Soviet Union was not asking for the return of Nansen passport people. They did not claim them of their own. That's the stateless people, the Nansen passport people. So it looked like probably a safer option. Now I want to think a little bit now about collective exercise of DP agency. And I think the first collective exercise we have to look at is refusal to repatriate. It is not the Allies' idea not to send them back. The Allies mean to send them back. And the reason they don't is that the resistance is so strong. This is organized resistance in small groups, but you can extend the picture to say that that it's a very widespread, sometimes active, but often passive resistance to being repatriated, which contributes to the fact that they are not repatriated forcibly. So that's the first a very successful exercise of agency. Then you have the issue of camps, of how the camps are organized. The UNRWA at first did not necessarily plan to put people into camps divided by nationality. In particular, they did not plan to put Jewish DPs into separate camps, in part because that seemed to them to be, that had a feel of a sort of Nazi-like feel of segregation. They didn't want to do that. On the other hand, but what they encounter is a very strong pressure from the DPs to do just that. The Jews will not go into camps with Poles and Ukrainians and so on, whom they regard as among their persecutors. And they have the support from very early on from international Jewish organizations like Joint and also from the US. So they won't. The Ukrainians and the Poles quite strongly want their own camps, and gradually what happens is that with UNRWA sort of more or less passive agreement, camps that have been of mixed nationality, often the people not of the dominant nationality leave for another camp. And here we come to the next bit, which is that UNRWA is a very democratic organization. It really is, and it believes in self-administration. And under the heading of rehabilitation, one of the things they're planning to do is to rehabilitate people to live a democratic life. And how better than to allow them to administer their own camps, and including appointing their own officers who are on salary from UNRWA, and appointing even their own internal police forces. So what happens is that in the camps, a dominant national group will secure those privileges and run the camps very strongly as Ukrainian camps, as Polish camps, as Latvian camps. Now, I don't mean that camps were always mixed, but that tendency to go on a national principle and to have the camps run by a powerful group, usually of very strongly nationalist, anti-communist, anti-Soviet DPs, that tendency is very strong and ever growing. One more choice that the DPs have, that is whether to live in camps or not to live in camps and just collect rations. That's extremely poorly documented in the archives, and here I put in one of my familiar warnings against trusting the archives too much, because UNRWA had good data on the people in its camps, and it had extremely poor data on the people not in its camps. especially because, like Misha, my husband, the people outside camps were usually signed up as in a camp. But in fact, they were living in the town, renting on the basis of their cigarette ration, paying in cigarettes or whatever, or by labor, because especially young men like Misha and his friends, they were all doing this. They were all free living in the towns with a landlady, and they helped out with chores. The landlady's husband is gone, the sons are gone, you know, there's no male help, so bringing the coal up from the cellar and that kind of thing, this, in addition to the cigarette ration, that's what Misha and his friends were contributing. People had all kinds of reasons for living outside camps. In the section of women DPs, I mean, many of them had linked up with some man, were living with someone, with different kinds of situation as to whether they're under the protection of somebody or whatever. But they live in the camps often. I mean, they live outside the camps. You're more likely to live outside the camp if you've got good German, for obvious reasons. It's just easier. In any case, so that's an option. And moving back and forth is an option. Moving in and out. All the documents in UNRWA will say that this is not happening and it's impossible, but then they will say we really must introduce penalties for people who do this. So it's obvious people are doing it, but in any case, I know they're doing it from the individual cases. To continue on the question of agency, what do you do as a DP? This is likely to last after, you know, since there's no obvious solution to what's going to happen to the DPs, this is going to be a matter of years. So how are you occupying yourself? And there really is a choice. One thing is that you can take a paid job. Basically, this will be with UNRWA or the occupying powers, and that is for people with secondary or better education, normally speaking, or rather secondary, because tertiary education was not greatly valued. But so it's for people with some literacy. So you can work for UNRWA, and that turns out to be quite a good thing. And I think people sense this as well, because this gives you connections, this gives you some people in authority that you know personally, and who knows how that may be useful in the future. You can go to university, or secondary school, or depending on, you know, your age. But one of the extraordinary things is that you could go to university, and the German universities, among the best in the world at the time, the Germans were they were told they had to take, I forget what it was, 10% of their students had to be DPs tuition free at first. They back off from this. But tuition free, you can go to German university. So Misha and all his friends, they finished the courses that were interrupted at the University of Riga, the engineering courses. And then they go on to do PhDs. Misha was able to go from Hanover, which was a good place to do engineering. He then went and did his PhD in physics at Heidelberg, which just happened to be the best place in the world for that kind of physics he was doing. So that was kind of lucky. Now, he was not strictly speaking as a PhD still on UNRWA. By this time changed to IRO, but he has the status of DP, but he's in the category living on the German economy. In other words, they are no longer providing him with rations, but they are still providing him with other privileges of a DP, which we'll come to later. So university is an option. Trading on the black market is a big option. That's something that everybody is involved in the black market a bit. I mean, you can't really live without it, but there are also a contingent of professional black market, so to speak, of people whose full-time occupation this is, exchanging goods basically that come from UNRWA or the US PX stores for German products. I mean, exchanging, also stealing, but in any way, so an exchange of goods takes place in which there is a group of middlemen in which DPs are prominent. One of the consequences of that is that they are not that popular with the German population. And they're not that popular because, among other things, because the rations they are getting are better than the rations the Germans are getting. They are a privileged group within occupation society. Now, the last thing that you can, the last basic important choice of occupation that you can make is, if you're a woman, to have babies. And this they did in enormous numbers. The literature focuses particularly on Jewish, on the high birth rate among Jewish DP women. And there is a whole discussion by Tina Grossman and so on of the felt need to replace to replenish population. But it is also true that all the other DP women were doing it as well, having children at a hugely higher than normal birth rate. And that includes, oddly enough, the Russian emigres, the stateless group. Once they get in, I'm a little puzzled by that, but anyway, that's just a footnote. And if you have a baby, it really is a very good situation to have a baby, with or without a husband, or husband, that is in inverted commas, because the question of who is formally married and so on, it becomes a fair, not a terribly interesting one. The social sanctions against sexual relations and children outside marriage are much relaxed from what they are in all the countries of origin. I mean, perhaps least the Soviet Union, but basically it's true across the board. And the DP camps are little welfare states. You have a baby there, and you've got a doctor on call, you've got nurses, you've got access to baby clothes and nappies, and you have a whole support system. Not to mention that you've got your fellow DPs, because some DPs are very active, some DPs are very inactive. It's basically your choice. And the visiting journalists tended to say they all are living in a state of demoralized idleness. That's not the impression I get from individual cases. It seems to me an awful lot of people were being almost frenetically active in their chosen field, whether it was making money on the black market, becoming a physicist, having a baby. They're all at it. Yes. Last thing on collective exercise of agency is, again, within the DP camps, under the leadership of these are elected, by the way, administrations, but the elected administrations, which tend to be very strongly nationalist and anti-communist, that nationalism is reinforced in the DP camps by an intensive organization of ranging from inculcation of patriotic education in actual schools, primary schools set up and secondary schools set up by the DPs themselves in their camps. Also through the Scouts movement, that's extremely popular among the DPs as both as a consolidation of a national identity and to some extent as paramilitary as well. That's across the board. It's the Slavic camps, but also, of course, the Jewish camps, just the same with the Zionist organization. And then there is the cultivation of nationality via the development of national crafts and making national costumes to put on when the UNRWA officials and the US congressmen come by, forming choirs to sing Latvian songs, Polish songs, and do Polish dances and so on. That's a very intensive activity, In the Latvian case I looked at, I was very taken by it because there's a particular kind of weaving which farmers, well, farmers in Latvia had forgotten how to practice, but in the interwar years, which is our years of creation of nationality, the years of the new republic, it is revived by the intelligentsia as a part of a way of reviving folk tradition, and there are special looms used for it. Now somehow they get these looms into some Latvian camps, and they continue this invention of nationality exercise in the camps, and with great success, because UNRWA helps. UNRWA gives sewing machines, UNRWA finds them cloth, and then when they emigrate, they bring it also into the diaspora. And churches, I should have said, they build churches. They actually build in the camps, in the best run of the camps. They build their own churches, and of course have an intensive religious life, including, and that of course has a certain piquancy with regard to the Soviet DPs, who in many cases will not have been brought up as Orthodox religion and as Orthodox believers. They may not even know, if they're urban, the forms of practice, but they learn them. That's one of the things you learn in the camps. In Mönchhof, I don't know if any of you have heard of that. That was the best known of the Russian camps, run by NTS, run by emigres and the anti-Soviet organization NTS, with an intensive cultivation of all of these, well, an intensive inculcation of the appropriate values. Theoretically, political activity is forbidden to the DPs. However, NTS is already publishing Pasiev, and Echo, also another journal, by sort of deals with different authorities. If you've got a series of authorities, of different military authorities and UNRWA, you've also got the possibility of getting a deal with one that the other one won't get, and so that is going on. Now, I see that, although I meant to leave lots and lots of time for questions and discussion, I haven't. But I will now try to condense the last part of my talk so that there is actually time for us to have conversation. Now, this is about the period in which it's the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, that is in control. They are set up in 1947 after UNRWA was defunded basically by the US. The IRO's mission is more limited. It is only looking after the DPs, whereas UNRWA had other tasks of of post-war reconstruction. IRO is the point of this is that this is really going to be under American control. Despite this, and then there's a certain amount of UNRWA seen as too left-wing, and there's a certain amount of pushing people out on that basis. However, there is actually quite a large personnel transfer from the one to the other. But the perception is you've had a move going along with the development of a Cold War antagonism between the former allies. This IRO is much more expressive of this new Cold War anti-Soviet attitude than UNRWA had been. The Soviet Union does not join IRO. It participates to some degree in discussions of it in the UN. The relationship to the UN is complicated. It exists, but it's not a UN agency. There is a relationship, but it's not a UN agency. So IRO comes in 1947, and the big thing about IRO, apart from more guaranteed American funding, is that it has a clear mission. Whereas UNRWA had all these displaced persons on their hands, and their mission was repatriation, but they couldn't be repatriated. So what? IRO has a solution, and that is resettlement. Resettlement means essentially resettlement outside Europe. There are some qualifications to that, I won't go into those complexities. But it means resettlement. In IRO goes around basically saying, looking for countries that need labor after the war. The US is, of course, understood to be on the list of possible destinations, and it's the one everyone wants to go to. Until 1948, however, the US hasn't quite made its mind up about taking DPs in large numbers. So the first nations to sign up, Australia, which wants labor, very straightforwardly wants labor, and is taking people on a two-year indenture program before they get released into the community to choose their own jobs. Canada, Israel, but that's a special case. I should say, however, in parentheses, that while all Jewish DPs can all, once the issue of once the British opposition to letting them go to Palestine is overcome, they can all go to Palestine, but they are also eligible to apply like other DPs for resettlement in other parts of the world, which about half of them do. But for the Slavic DPs, it's the only options are going home, which remains an option. You could still individually repatriate, or being resettled in Australia, Canada, Latin America. There were big hopes on Latin America. The numbers turned out to be small, but they're in there. Few small numbers go to, say, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. But as it turns out, the biggest recipient is the United States after the passing of the 1948 DP Act. And this is where Soviet complaints become about theft of their people rise to a very high volume. And it's now explained what this theft is about. This theft is labor for the colonies. It's the capitalist world looking, the US is here still a colony, looking for labor, looking for cheap labor, cheap manual labor, and stealing stealing via deceit and intimidation Soviet citizens for that purpose. Now, there's, if we're thinking about DP agency, there is, of course, huge scope for agency in this new situation, because the IRO is not allocating the DPs to particular countries. The setup is that those countries will, most of them, US of course did it differently, but others, they send a selection mission to Europe, and that, with IRO's organizational help, that interviews applicants from the DPs for settlement in the various countries. And so the DPs, it isn't that the DP can say, I'm going to go to Chile, and you go to Chile, but you can decide that Chile is where you're going to apply first, and you have a list of preferences. So there is absolutely intensive in the DP world research on the prospects in all the different places. Huge amounts of often inaccurate information, but nevertheless information exchange. There's a DP press, it's full of a DP Russian and Ukrainian language press, which the IRO and UNRWA fund, full of information about the places. People are getting hold of, let's say, the Sydney Morning Herald to look at employment opportunities. They are really doing their homework on this thing. And most of them, so many of them don't get their first choice because their first choice is often the United States, is almost always the United States. But you've got a chance of getting your first choice, and if you have a very strong objection to going somewhere, you also have quite a good chance of not going there. In other words, nobody is going to force you to go to Paraguay if that happens to be a place that you just couldn't bear to go. At the end of this process, but of course there are people who are not going to be selected by anyone. And who are those people? Those are people with who are old. Old is really bad. Sick is bad. TB and VD, venereal disease, which are common, those are bad. bad to different extents for different countries. Australia is extremely, it's full of sort of eugenics enthusiasm. The Australian medical selection is incredibly rigorous. I mean, if you lost a finger in an industrial accident, that's likely to disqualify you from in Australia. If you've got a squint, I mean, extraordinary things. Another problem is psychiatric illness. An awful lot of DPs are understandably in bad shape, and they're in and out of mental hospitals. And nobody, they're even a problem for repatriation, because the Soviet Union will take back their their mental cases, but almost nobody else will. So they tend to get left. Yes, the old, the sick, and of course intellectuals, because who wants intellectuals? Intellectuals and professors and military officers, absolutely, the lawyers in particular. Professors, lawyers, military officers, absolutely at the bottom of anybody's list. Who wants them? It is as bad as having an advanced form of tuberculosis to be in that category. Many countries like Australia straight out say, we are not taking any intellectuals. We want horny-handed sons of toil. That's what we said in a very poetic flourish. Now, of course, they take some intellectuals, but there is a sort of hardcore left in Germany, and the threaten to leave, and some actually remain in Germany. But the other hardcore, and I'm going to say this extremely quickly, the other hardcore is collaborators from East Europe, Eastern Europe, particularly, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Baltics, and so on. Collaborators who did not manage to disguise themselves well enough to get out early enough. Many of them did. Many had been successful, but many had not been successful. And IRO, in its internal correspondence, considers what to do with these people. And that includes all the people who fought for the Latvian Legion, who may or may not have volunteered, the people who fought in Ruski Korpus. So what are they going to do? And IRO decides they're going to cheat, because their constitution says that we are not going to accept any collaborators as displaced persons entitled to repatriation. They decide they have to cheat, and they will not send them themselves, but they will arrange through third parties to get them out. This is actually not, I mean, you could say this was a manifestation of the right-wing turn in IRO, but I don't think it is. I think Kingsley, he's an old New Deal person, the director at this point. I think he's simply faced with a huge administrative problem. I mean, if they don't find something to do with the collaborators, then what? I mean, they're going to be left for the Germans, and although now we can look back and say that the West German state was a very competent one and could deal with all kinds of things, at that point there was a fear of simply preventing its emergence as a functioning state. So collaborators are sent off, and there's many to America, many to Canada, many to Australia. And that's a whole story that perhaps could be talked about another time. Thank you.
Thank you. This is amazing new material. These topics are not ones that have been widely spread, and they're very important in the whole conception of and historiography of the origins of the Cold War. So maybe that also can be something. So I have Hillary, Natalie, Sophia, and Abigail.
Hi, thanks. This is fascinating. I'm struck by the list of countries you mentioned. US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and Israel are all settler colonies. They all have that in common. And I'm wondering how you explain that those are the places that were open to taking displaced persons from Eastern Europe, and what, if anything, the significance of that is.
Natalie.
I'm really curious to hear more about some of the gendered aspects of agency, especially taking on the idea of Yuval Davis's gender as a border guard. and how agency for men and women was perceived differently. For example, even like in the Gulag, for example, women's agency, the options that they had, they were often shamed for. And migrants today, when we think about refugees today, again, that access to agency for women causes a lot of fear because of starting new families and the idea of culture being influenced negatively by women pursuing their agency by marrying someone or pursuing some other type of situation to get themselves settled, or by having children to feel more settled or more secure. So I was just curious how agency is discussed for women in this situation.
The first time gender has been mentioned in our seminar.
Sorry.
No, why sorry? That's interesting that it took so long. Sophia.
There are just two things that I was curious to hear more about. The first is you kind of touched on it, but conflict between different groups of DPs. So you spoke about how they essentially became run along nationalist lines. But I was just wondering how deep that conflict went. And then the second one is, in the memoirs, have you found many cases where people speak about their emotions? I'm wondering if it's kind of practical recollections of what happened, or whether you do get an insight into how these people actually felt.
And finally, Abigail.
This is such an interesting, immersive entry into the world of the DPs, so I really enjoyed this. And I was wondering about the physical space of the DP camps. How common was it for DPs to choose to integrate into the local areas where their camps were? And did any of these camps develop into more permanent settlements, or did they just disappear?
Okay, Sheila, you got a basket full there.
Okay. Yeah, first of all, settler colonies, I think basically the decision to resettle them is to resettle them in white countries. Now, you will not find any document that says that, and you will find a certain amount of, a little bit of discussion with India, for example, can you take anyone? But it doesn't go anywhere. And you know, China is not on, there's also a little bit of discussion about China, but I mean, it's in the middle of civil war. And so I think it seems natural to send them to white, which tends to be the Anglosphere also. So I think it's the whiteness. I mean, I think whiteness is a part of this story that really needs to be paid attention to. Especially as I failed to get to my major point. This is awful. Goodness, I am obviously getting tired. The reason that U.S. Congress will finally buy them out is the redefinition of DPs as victims of communism, because they fled from Eastern Europe. Sorry, that's really awful that anyway, they fled from Eastern Europe, so this is. That's what enables the solution. That's what, and the other thing I didn't introduce was the parallel with the approximately similar group of Palestinian refugees in the Middle East dealt by a separate authority, whereas my DPs are settled within 7 years in first world countries, semi of their choice. What happened to the Palestinians? It's very hard not to see whiteness as a factor here. Gender. That I did write a piece on this called "The Women's Side of the Story." It's absolutely fascinating. It is really different sets of choices you have all the time, and including on repatriation. It is much safer to repatriate for a woman. Your chances, and this was not known. I can't help feeling that it must have been instinctively semi-known. You would not have expected. I don't think people seriously thought that the women Ostasiabata were going to be rounded up and sent to Gulag. And they certainly were not, but I think probably people didn't. Yes, but within the camps, I mean, in the DP framework, women's options are different. I mean, women could also go to university, women could also do black market, and I have examples of both of those. But the more obvious a way for a woman to survive, a woman alone, and most of these are young women on their own, is by finding a male protector. And there are lots of them around. There is, you know, an occupation army of I forget how many, you know, I mean 1 million strong or whatever it is, huge. So and with so that's an option. If all along there have been, I mean, for Ostarbeiter, although despite complications, there is the possibility of finding a German protector, and then of course you may also link up with another DP of another national place of origin, and then this really quite extraordinary situation that you can have a baby in relative comfort and security. And I think one of the points about having a baby is that it is the hope that it may consolidate what is otherwise a fairly random sexual contact with somebody, and in particular that this may help in resettlement, because some kinds of people are more resettleable than others. And if you, I mean, for example, it's always good to link up with a Latvian because they're very well regarded by all resettlement committees as educated, middle class, clean, polite, often know English. So that if, whereas, so there's a hierarchy, basically, and the hierarchy changes in the different circumstances, but I think there's an awful lot of calculation in the personal relations. And then just to jump to the question of memoirs, this is absolutely not represented in the memoirs. Nobody, you write memoirs for your children, and the last thing you want to tell them is about the GI boyfriends you had and how, and the one that got away and you were hoping you could get to Chicago but didn't come off. I mean, I've actually interviewed people who said they were terribly surprised because the memoir story is the pawns of fate, you know, tossed around. People who would find these pictures of their mother elegantly dressed and made up with hair well done in an officers' club holding a glass of champagne, and say, what is this? This is Germany in 1947? Well, it was. That was a choice available for many people. Now, having children can also, of course, complicate things because the person you may want to emigrate with may not be, well, in fact, is quite often not the father of the child. That was very often, people managed to overlook that. In other words, the child, many young DP women by the time of emigration had a child, and they were with a man, not always the father of the child, and but that would be entered. When they exited as a family with him as the father of the child by internal negotiation. Physical space. They're in a variety of different, the camps in a variety of different locations. Some are in former barracks, some are in schools, some are in you know, repurposed hospitals. None of them are camps in the sense of newly set up arrangement of tents or whatever. In fact, one of the DP fears, and one often mentioned in connection with Palestine, is you might have to live in a tent. You know, the fear of living in a tent as against in your quite comfortable, sometimes you're living even in private houses, sequestered from the Germans. So as to what happens afterwards, because you're usually in an area that's been, I mean, in buildings built for another purpose. When you leave, those buildings are repurposed for whatever, you know, whatever function, and so you don't find. Well, there are some strange exceptions to this. There's a very small movement of DPs to set up a memorialization process for the suffering of DPs at the hands of the Germans. It's a very curious, and they in their camp in Flossenburg, I think it is. They set up memorials. They also they attempted to create a physical monument that would survive their departure, which it partly did, but only partly. But that was very rare. Mainly the DPs left, and the Germans came in and took back or repurposed the space.
Yeah, of course, this is a fascinating topic, but you forgot the Armenians. So let me tell you that this idea of nationality actually went two ways. So there was a guy whose name is escaping, but George somebody, who owned a very famous San Francisco restaurant, Omer Khayyam. And George Madikian, I think his name was, decided he's going to bring the Armenians from those DP camps. And he was basically affiliated with the more nationalist, anti-communist side of the Armenian diaspora, the Dashnak Suchun. And so they organized this thing, and they got influential people to back them. And they brought Armenians, some of whom had been collaborators, because there had been an Armenian legion too, working with the Germans. The leader of those Armenian legions, Dro and Nijde, are both heroes now in post-Soviet Armenia. So they are our equivalent of those Ukrainians who collaborated. And people named their children, even Nijde or Dro or whatever. I was very taken by the fluidity of identity, that you could instrumentally and kind of opportunistically choose which of the things you wanted. And this is actually a very important story, the way you told it as well, in the origins of the Cold War. Because as you noted at various points, what seems to be American altruism, in fact, is well politically motivated. That is, UNRWA is ultimately something that we don't really want all those people, or do we need to have all those people here? Remember, Lend-Lease, which was our aid to the Soviets, was abrogated right away as soon as the war ended, and then under protest was reinstated and then ended again. And the Marshall Plan, which is so fundamental to our understanding of the Cold War, was about, you make your economy like ours, we'll send you aid, and you'll spend that money in the United States. Right? So nice, we'll recreate capitalist societies. The Soviets wanted to be part of that early on. Molotov went to Paris, but ultimately the demands, you can't have state control, there has to be free markets, etc., forced them out and they formed their own bloc. So these stories, it seems to me, are very intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just, I really did omit the whole point of the conclusion of my paper, but just to underline the Cold War element. I mean, it is because of the Cold War and the reformulation as victims of communism that Congress will keep funding it. But then there is enormous propaganda advantage from, look, all these people chose freedom. They chose that. You remember, this is a time when in the US there's also tremendous, really very big publicity about defectors. And Kasienkina, the leap to freedom, and so on. Anyway, she was somebody who jumped out of the window of the Soviet consulate in New York. And so the notion that over there is dark and terrible, but some brave souls have got out, the model of the defector is applied to the displaced person who did not leave voluntarily. The whole point about being displaced is that you got there by accident, but the new persona that you can assume is and that can be attributed to you is this one of somebody who sought freedom, who could not stand the oppression of Soviet totalitarianism. And of course, it is also the case that in all the selection committees of the white settler colonies, one of the things you have to say, you have to be asked why you left the Soviet Union, and you have to say, I left it because of, I couldn't stand the political regime, I couldn't stand the oppression. Everybody, you're coached on this, basically. It is necessary to make a protestation of anti-communist faith for, I think, every country except, you know, I mentioned Paraguay, and that was very unfair because I think they didn't have it. And one of the other small Latin American countries didn't have it. But everybody else, by the time that the DPs are being resettled, the damaging thing in the past that you certainly didn't want on your record is anything connected with communism, anything connected with Nazism, and collaboration has become much less important to the officials with whom you're dealing.
So this has really been wonderful. The generation of the liberal hegemony discourse that we live in now, and which Tom Graham and others have referred to, is already in Sheila's story. So let's thank her for this wonderful